Heavy drops shatter against the concrete porch steps. The storm is unforgiving, washing out the streetlights and turning the suburban driveway into a rushing river. Marcus, the CEO of Global Freight Logistics, leans heavily against the doorframe. His custom-tailored trench coat is plastered to his back, water streaming down his face and pooling at his expensive leather shoes. He raises a fist and pounds on the solid oak door again. The sound is dull, heavy, desperate. Behind him, shivering in the deluge, stands Bryce. 3 weeks ago, the vice president of Tech's Italian wool suit had been immaculate. Now, the dark fabric is saturated, clinging heavily to his shivering frame. His hair is plastered to his forehead. He stares at his soggy loafers, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looks physically diminished, utterly defeated. Marcus pounds again, his knuckles turning raw. "Arthur, I know you're in there. The driveway camera is watching us. Please, open the door." The porch light flickers on, casting a harsh yellow halo over the two executives. The deadbolt clicks, heavy, metallic, final. The door swings inward. Warm air, carrying the faint, comforting scent of Earl Grey tea and wood smoke, spills out into the freezing rain. Arthur stands in the entryway. He wears a faded gray cardigan, worn corduroy slacks, and thick-soled house slippers. He holds a ceramic mug in one hand, the steam curling up toward the ceiling. He doesn't look surprised. He doesn't look angry. He just watches them, his eyes steady behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Marcus," Arthur says. His voice is a low, even gravel. "Arthur." Marcus exhales, a shaky breath that turns into a cloud of white vapor in the chill air. It's gone. The whole network, every distribution center from Seattle to Frankfurt is dark. The freight manifests are locked down. The tracking APIs are returning fatal errors, and the automated cold storage facilities are resetting. Marcus swallows hard, the panic cracking through his polished exterior. "We're bleeding $30 million an hour. The supply chain has completely halted." Arthur takes a slow sip of his tea. His gaze shifts from the CEO to the younger man standing in the rain. "Bryce." Bryce flinches. He forces his head up, rainwater dripping from his nose. "Arthur," he manages to say, his voice tight. "I thought CloudSync AI was agile," Arthur says. "The delivery is flat, completely devoid of mockery. It's a simple statement of fact. I thought it was synergized." Bryce opens his mouth, but nothing comes out. He looks away, staring back down at the flooded driveway. "We need you back," Marcus pleads, taking a half-step forward, careful not to cross the threshold into Arthur's home. "Name your price. Double your old salary. Triple it. Stock options. A corner office. Just fix it, please." Arthur looks at the rain drumming against the concrete. He looks at the two men who run a global empire, now reduced to standing on his porch in a severe storm on a Tuesday night. "I don't want a corner office, Marcus." Arthur steps back. "I like the basement." 3 weeks earlier. The basement server room doesn't have windows. It doesn't have natural light, or espresso machines, or ergonomic standing desks. It has the hum. It's a deep, vibrating drone that settles right into the bones. Rows upon rows of black steel racks stretch into the dim distance, housing the heavy iron of global freight logistics. The air is aggressive. The massive crack units, computer room air conditioning, blast freezing air up through the perforated metal tiles of the raised floor, keeping the ambient temperature at a strict, unyielding 62 degrees. The structural pillars are thick concrete, grounding the vast digital infrastructure. Arthur sits at a battered steel desk wedged between Rack 14 and the secondary power distribution unit. He wears a thick fleece jacket zipped all the way to the chin. His workspace is an island of analog utility in a sea of sterile hardware. a stack of heavy printed technical manuals, a half-empty mug of black coffee, and a physical pager clipped to the edge of a monitor stand. On the screen in front of him, a Datadog dashboard is turning red. The visualization graph, usually a steady rolling sequence of API requests and database queries, spikes violently into the danger zone. Error rates cascade rapidly across the application layer. The modern routing software, built by teams of engineers 3 floors up, is failing to process a localized data surge from the Chicago hub. Arthur doesn't blink. He sets his coffee down. His fingers hover over the heavy mechanical keys of an old IBM Model M keyboard. Then he begins to type. The clack of the switches is sharp, rhythmic, cutting precisely through the ambient roar of the cooling fans. He doesn't use a mouse. He doesn't open a graphical interface. He pulls up a terminal window, the background a void of black, the text a harsh phosphor green. He connects directly to the core, the legacy mainframe, the foundational architecture of the company that handles the raw physical logic of the freight network. While the modern APIs trigger automated alerts upstairs, throwing null pointer exceptions and timeout errors, Arthur inputs the legacy commands. COBOL. He types lines of rigid, structured syntax, bypassing the failing middleware entirely. He reroutes the logic directly at the database level, forcing the Chicago hub's manifests to clear out of the processing queue and into a secondary spool. The physical pager on his desk suddenly erupts, vibrating violently against the metal desk and emitting a shrill, piercing alarm. The on-call alert. The modern monitoring system has finally registered the critical failure. Arthur reaches out with one hand, silences the pager without looking, and hits enter on his final command block. On the monitor to his left, the red spikes on the Grafana dashboard hold at the peak for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the line drops, a sheer, vertical decline back down to the baseline. The red warnings flicker out, replaced by steady, reassuring green. The routing crisis is resolved before the incident response teams upstairs have even convened. Arthur leans back in his chair. The plastic creaks under his weight. He picks up his mug, takes a sip of the cold, bitter coffee, and goes back to reading a dog-eared paperback novel. He's the sole architect who understands how the deep system actually operates in relation to physical logistics. He's the single point of failure. 2 hours later, the atmosphere in the glass boardroom is entirely different. Located on the 52nd floor, the room is bathed in warm morning sunlight. Floor-to-ceiling windows offer a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city skyline. The table is crafted from a single slab of reclaimed walnut. The air smells of freshly roasted espresso beans. At the head of the table stands Bryce. He's 34, impeccably groomed, wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal wool suit. He holds a sleek presentation clicker in his hand, moving with a restless kinetic pacing as he delivers his pitch. Behind him, a massive 4K display glows with a minimalist, high-contrast slide deck. The future, Bryce says, his voice projecting easily across the expansive room, isn't about maintenance, it's about velocity. He clicks the remote. A new slide appears. It features a graphic of a sleek, abstract cloud absorbing outdated, gray server racks. For too long, global freight has been weighed down by sunsetting legacy overhead. We're running a 21st century logistics empire on architecture designed decades ago. Bryce paces down the side of the table, making direct eye contact with Marcus, the CEO, who sits attentively, nodding along. Our proposed solution is Cloud Sync AI. Bryce continues, his tone unwavering and confident. A complete, synergistic cloud migration. We remove the localized hardware. We transition entirely to scalable, agile optimization. No more physical bottlenecks. No more reliance on archaic code bases. Arthur sits at the very end of the long walnut table. He sits motionless, a stark anomaly amid the polished executives. He's still wearing his thick fleece over a faded flannel shirt. His employee ID badge, scratched and yellowing with age, hangs from a frayed lanyard. He doesn't have a laptop open. He has a single yellow legal pad and a standard ballpoint pen. He watches Bryce with an unblinking, neutral gaze, registering the presentation without a shift in posture. "We need to eliminate our dependencies," Bryce says, stopping a few feet from Arthur. He gestures toward Arthur's end of the table. The executives shift in their leather chairs, directing their attention to the veteran engineer. "We have what the industry calls a bus factor problem. Entire sectors of our routing logic are maintained by isolated individuals using legacy languages. It's a risk profile that's completely unacceptable for a modern enterprise." Bryce maintains a rigid, professional smile. "No offense, Arthur, but we must standardize our infrastructure to match our growth." The room goes very still. A few executives look down at their digital tablets, avoiding the direct confrontation. Marcus watches carefully, observing the interaction. Arthur doesn't bristle. He doesn't sit up straighter. He slowly clicks his ballpoint pen, once, twice. "The legacy system," Arthur says, his voice quiet but carrying clearly down the length of the table, "is what stopped the Chicago hub from going dark this morning." Bryce's expression tightens. He waves a hand, dismissing the point. "A minor API delay. A symptom of the exact structural decay I'm talking about. CloudSync's auto-scaling would have mitigated that instantly without human intervention." CloudSync, Arthur replies evenly, processes data. It doesn't calculate the physical weight of freight. When a truck blows a tire on Interstate 80, the database doesn't just need to update a ledger. It needs to calculate which secondary warehouse has the structural and thermal capacity to take a redirected 10-ton load of refrigerated pharmaceuticals before they spoil in transit. The old code integrates those physical world constraints. "The old code is obsolete, Arthur." Bryce counters, his volume rising slightly, clearly irritated by the interruption. "And frankly, the methodology behind it is no longer scalable. We're moving forward. The board has approved the migration budget. We initiate the cutover to CloudSync in 3 weeks, right before the peak holiday shipping surge." Arthur stops clicking his pen. He looks at Bryce. Then he looks down the table at Marcus. 3 weeks, Arthur says, during the peak surge. "It'll be a seamless automated transition," Bryce insists, turning back to the CEO to regain control of the room. "We'll deprecate the mainframe." Marcus leans forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looks at Arthur, a measure of pragmatic calculation in his eyes. "Arthur, you've been with us for 28 years. You built the foundation. But Bryce's mandate has board approval. We need modernization. We're offering you a comprehensive severance package. Early retirement, full benefits." Arthur looks at his yellow legal pad. It's completely blank. He doesn't argue. He doesn't raise his voice to explain that removing the mainframe without mapping the deeply embedded physical logistics constraints will cause a cascading failure. He has spent decades maintaining the core logic while the executive tier focused on upper-level abstraction. If they're committed to a full system replacement, he has no further input to offer. Arthur closes the cap on his ballpoint pen. He stands up. The legs of his chair scrape loudly against the hardwood floor, echoing sharply in the quiet room. He looks directly at Marcus. "Make sure my final check is printed," Arthur says, "not direct deposited." The payroll API relies on the mainframe's scheduling logic. When Bryce turns it off, the digital transfer protocols will fail to resolve. Bryce exhales a sharp breath. That's inaccurate. We have redundant protocols for. Arthur doesn't wait for the explanation. He turns and walks toward the heavy glass doors. He pushes them open and steps out into the hallway, leaving the boardroom and the migration plan behind, heading back down to the freezing basement to pack up his desk. The corporate break room at Global Freight Solutions smells faintly of burnt coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Fluorescent tubes hum overhead, casting a sickly, pale light over the beige linoleum. At the far corner table, deliberately positioned away from the chatter of the marketing team, Arthur sits alone. He unwraps a foil packet containing a simple ham and cheese sandwich. His hands are thick, the knuckles scarred from decades of pulling heavy cables through tight drop silings. Next to his lunch rests a 90-page, spiral-bound document printed on heavy, glossy stock. The cover features a sleek, minimalist graphic of a floating cloud and a bold, sans-serif title, Project Apex, a synergistic cloud migration. A few tables over, 3 junior project managers are laughing, their lanyards jingling as they discuss the upcoming launch party for the new software. They don't look in Arthur's direction. To them, he's a ghost, a relic of a department they're actively trying to dismantle. Arthur chews his sandwich slowly, his eyes scanning the colorful diagrams. The pages are filled with hollow corporate geometry, concentric circles, floating nodes, and endless arrows pointing toward buzzwords like agile optimization and next-gen scalability. He ignores the marketing copy, skipping the mission statements about frictionless delivery, and flips directly to the technical specifications in the appendix. His calloused, ink-stained finger traces the proposed architecture for the database load balancing. The refrigerator motor kicks on with a shuddering rattle, blending with the high-pitched drone of the overhead lights. Arthur's finger stops moving. He frowns, leaning closer to the page. The new cloud system is designed to route all incoming global shipping manifests through a centralized API gateway. Before writing to the distributed database, he pulls a worn, metal-barreled mechanical pencil from his shirt pocket. He clicks it once. He scribbles a rapid calculation in the margin. The holiday shipping season generates tens of millions of concurrent requests. The API gateway has a hard-coded rate limit to prevent external attacks. But the architects haven't accounted for the sheer volume of internal recursive calls generated by the legacy COBOL subroutines. When the system hits peak load on Black Friday, the API will bottleneck. The queue will fill, memory will max out, and the entire logistical network will freeze dead in the water. It's a catastrophic, fatal flaw hidden behind pretty graphics. Arthur circles the gateway node. The graphite presses hard into the glossy paper, nearly tearing it. He closes the binder, packs up his half-eaten sandwich, and stands. The 74th floor operates in a different reality. The air up here is triple-filtered, perfectly climate-controlled, and smells of expensive citrus room spray. Bryce's corner office features expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline. There are no filing cabinets here, no stray cables, no server racks, no manuals. Just a stark, white-standing desk, a row of Lucite Leadership Awards, and a pristine glass-walled whiteboard covered in abstract neon post-it notes. Bryce is pacing across the plush gray carpet, wearing wireless earbuds and holding a bright green kale smoothie. He's 32, dressed in a tailored vest and pristine sneakers. No, no, no. You tell them we're sunsetting the legacy overhead by Q3. Bryce says into the air, gesturing broadly with his free hand. We need to lean into the agile mindset. Pivot the deliverables. I want that friction eliminated. We're building a frictionless ecosystem, and anything that doesn't scale dynamically is dead weight. He taps his earbud, ending the call, and finally notices Arthur standing quietly in the doorway. Bryce sighs, flashing a bright, practiced smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Artie, what can I do for you? Make it quick. I've got a sync with the board in 4 minutes. Arthur walks forward. He places the thick Project Apex binder on the immaculate white desk. It lands with a heavy, dull thud. He flips it open and taps the page, pointing directly at the circled API gateway. The load balancer, Arthur says. His voice is a low, gravelly rumble, unused to speaking over the hum of servers. It's capped. Holiday traffic will overwhelm the queue. Bryce chuckles, taking a slow sip of his smoothie. He leans against his standing desk, looking down at Arthur. Artie, you're looking at this through the lens of a dinosaur. That's a dynamically scaling cloud gateway. It expands infinitely. Not when it interacts with the COBOL mainframe, Arthur says, holding Bryce's gaze. The legacy system requires persistent, stateful connections to verify physical cargo weight. The Cloud API treats them as stateless requests. At 3 million requests an hour, it will create a recursive loop. It won't scale. It will crash. Bryce rolls his eyes, setting his smoothie down. He straightens his posture, adopting the tone of a patient teacher dealing with a slow student. Listen to yourself, Artie. Persistent connections. You're clinging to the past. The whole point of Project Apex is to break away from that monolithic, antiquated mindset. We're disrupting our own supply chain. We're moving fast. If you move fast with this architecture, Arthur says, keeping his voice dead level, freight stops moving entirely. Ships will sit in ports. Trucks will idle. Billions of dollars in logistics will freeze. Fix the queue logic. Bryce's smile vanishes. His jaw tightens. I'm not going to stall a $90 million rollout because our resident basement troll is afraid of the cloud. I have Stanford engineers who architected this. They know what they're doing. You need to get with the agile mindset, or you need to get out of the way. Arthur stares at him. The sheer towering wall of arrogance is impenetrable. Arthur reaches out, picks up his mechanical pencil, and slides it back into his pocket. He leaves the binder on the desk. Good luck, Bryce, Arthur says softly. He turns and walks out of the glass office. 3 floors below ground, the atmosphere shifts completely. The sub-basement server room is a cavern of relentless, mechanical noise. Massive crack units roar at the far ends of the hall, pumping frigid, dehumidified air through the heavy, perforated floor tiles. The raised flooring rattles faintly underfoot, a physical heartbeat of the enterprise. Row after row of black server racks stretch into the dim distance, blinking with thousands of green, amber, and red LEDs. The air smells of ozone, hot dust, and electrified metal. Here, in the freezing, roaring dark, Arthur is a king in exile. He sits in a battered, duct-taped office chair in front of a bank of heavy, outdated monitors. The screens display pure text, cascading lines of pale green COBOL code against a pitch-black background. To his left, resting precariously on top of a warm server chassis, is the latest issue of Tech Today magazine. The glossy cover features a high-resolution, heavily retouched portrait of Bryce, arms crossed, smiling confidently under the headline, "The Agile Visionary, Sunsetting the Past." Arthur ignores the magazine. His fingers move across the mechanical keyboard with blinding, rhythmic precision. Clack, clack, clack. A red alert flashes on his secondary monitor. A memory leak in the Chicago dispatch node. The legacy system is straining under the weight of modern API queries, hammering its ancient ports. Up on the 74th floor, the flashy new Datadog and Grafana dashboards haven't even registered the anomaly yet. They're too slow, too buffered by layers of abstraction. Arthur doesn't wait for a ticket. He doesn't open a support task. He types a manual override command, isolating the corrupted memory sector and rerouting the freight data through a secondary physical switch in Atlanta. The red text on his screen turns green. The crisis is averted. Total elapsed time, 14 seconds. Across the globe, massive cargo ships continue to load shipping containers. Fleets of 18-wheelers pull out of distribution centers. Millions of packages move seamlessly along conveyor belts. All of it, every single physical movement, is orchestrated by the aging mainframe humming around Arthur. His black plastic pager buzzes heavily against his belt, a critical temperature warning in rack 4. Arthur pulls the pager off his hip, silences the alarm, and stands up. He grabs a heavy flashlight and a wrench from his toolkit. He walks down the freezing aisle, a solitary figure moving through the mechanical guts of a global empire. He's the bus factor of one, the only man on Earth who understands how the ghosts in the machine actually work. And his time is running out. The calendar notification arrived with a sharp, sterile chime over the desktop speakers. A single line of text. Quick sync, conference room 4B. Arthur stared at the screen. He knew the language of the company better than anyone. A meeting request sent at 3:45 on a Friday afternoon, right before the Thanksgiving holiday week, was never a quick sync. He wiped a smudge of thermal paste from his thumb with a paper towel, locked his terminal, and took the elevator up from the sub-basement. The air on the executive floor smelled different. Down in the server room, the air was a physical force. Heavy, chilled to exactly 64 degrees by the roaring crack units, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone and hot silicon. Up here, the air was dead. It smelled of expensive carpet cleaner and lavender oil from an automated diffuser. Conference room 4B was a glass cage with frosted acoustic panels. Inside, Bryce sat leaning far back in an ergonomic mesh chair, spinning a silver stylus between his fingers. He wore a fitted navy blazer and a smart watch that glowed every few seconds with notifications. Beside him sat a woman in a severe charcoal suit, her hands perfectly folded over a thick manila envelope. Human resources. Arthur walked in. The heavy glass door sealed shut behind him, cutting off the low murmur of the sales floor outside. The room was aggressively quiet. "Arthur, grab a seat," Bryce said. He didn't stop spinning the stylus. Arthur remained standing. He rested one thick, calloused hand on the back of a plastic chair. Bryce sighed, a manufactured sound of corporate sympathy, and leaned forward to plant his elbows on the glass table. "Let's get right to it. You've seen the metrics on the dashboard. The cloud migration is fully operational. We're entering a new phase of agile optimization, which means we have to make some hard choices about resource allocation." Arthur looked at the HR representative. She avoided his eyes, staring fixedly at the envelope. "We're sunsetting your role to optimize payroll," Bryce continued, his voice slick and practiced. "We're transitioning away from legacy overhead. The new infrastructure is synergistic. It's automated. We don't need someone manually holding the steering wheel anymore. The system drives itself." The HR woman finally spoke, her voice a flat, rehearsed monotone. "Arthur, this folder contains your separation agreement. It outlines your severance package, your COBRA benefits, and a standard non-disclosure agreement. Your network access has already been restricted, effective as of 4 minutes ago." She slid the envelope across the smooth glass. It stopped inches from Arthur's hand. Bryce offered a tight, gleaming smile. "Your hard work got us to this point, Art. Really. But the board expects a modern, cloud-first ecosystem. We just don't have the budget to keep a mechanic on staff when there are no moving parts left to break." Arthur looked down at the envelope. Through the frosted glass wall behind Bryce, he could see the giant digital displays on the main floor. The Thanksgiving shipping volume was already tracking in the red. Millions of packages. Billions of dollars in freight. The API calls between Bryce's shiny new cloud interface and the ancient COBOL mainframe, holding the actual database, were skyrocketing. Arthur looked back at Bryce. He saw the arrogance in the young executive's jaw, the absolute, blind certainty of a man who had never been woken up at 3 in the morning by a cascading database failure. "I don't need a pen," Arthur said. His voice was low, a rough rasp of gravel cutting through the sterile room. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his own battered ballpoint, and opened the folder. He didn't read the corporate jargon. He flipped to the last page, signed his name on the line, and closed it. "Security will need to escort you to your desk to collect your personal items," the HR woman said, her voice dropping a fraction of an inch in volume. Arthur turned around and pushed the glass door open. He didn't look back. The walk to the sub-basement felt longer than usual. A security guard named Marcus, a heavy-set man Arthur had shared break-room coffee with for nearly a decade, followed him in a miserable, awkward shuffle, keeping 3 paces behind. When they reached the IT staging area, the familiar, comforting roar of the cooling fans greeted Arthur like an old friend. The vibration in the floorboards was a language he understood. He pulled a standard, flat-packed cardboard banker's box from a supply shelf and popped it into shape. He moved methodically. He packed a faded, chipped ceramic mug, a thick, spiral-bound reference manual for IBM mainframes with heavily dog-eared pages, a spare pair of reading glasses. He reached behind his monitors and traced the thick braided cable of his heavy, mechanical keyboard. He unplugged it, wound the cord neatly around the heavy plastic chassis, and laid it in the box. He looked at his screens. The session had timed out. A red lock icon sat in the center of the display. But on the secondary monitor, the external Datadog readouts were still active. The latency lines on the graph were beginning to jitter, tiny, jagged spikes. The system was already struggling to translate the massive influx of holiday data through Bryce's untested integration layers. Arthur stared at the spikes for a long moment. He reached out and clicked the monitor's power button. The screen faded to black. Then he reached down to his hip. His fingers brushed the heavy, hardened plastic of his company-issued emergency pager. The device was a relic, completely isolated from the cloud networks, wired directly to the core mainframe's critical alarm system. It had dictated his sleep schedule, ruined his vacations, and anchored him to this building for 22 years. The edges of the plastic were worn smooth from thousands of frantic thumb presses in the dead of night. He unclipped it from his leather belt. It felt incredibly heavy in his palm. Arthur set the pager down on the exact center of his empty desk. He nudged it with his index finger, adjusting it until its edges were perfectly parallel with the edge of the desk. He picked up the cardboard box. "You good, Art?" Marcus asked quietly from the doorway. "I'm good, Marcus," Arthur said. He walked out of the room. The heavy steel fire door swung shut, the magnetic lock engaging with a heavy, final thud. On the desk, in the empty humming room, the black pager sat in perfect stillness. The Network Operations Center on the top floor of the Chicago headquarters hums with the steady sound of cooling fans and quiet conversations. A massive wall of seamless LED monitors casts a cool, sterile blue glow over the room. The primary dashboard displays the global logistics network, a rhythmic pulse of green lines, mapping thousands of cargo planes, freight trains, and 18-wheelers moving across the continent. Standing near the center console is Bryce, the director of cloud infrastructure. He watches the screens with focused intensity, surrounded by his team of reliability engineers. "All right, everyone," Bryce says, his voice projecting clearly across the room. The legacy system has served us well, but we need the capacity of the new architecture to handle the Q4 volume. Let's execute the cutover. He nods to David, the lead systems engineer. Initiating the migration, David says, his fingers moving methodically across his keyboard, rerouting traffic to the new gateway now. On the massive wall of monitors, the dense, blocky text of the legacy routing protocol is replaced by a modern operational dashboard. A dial in the center of the screen labeled Global Traffic smoothly ticks up to 100%. The connection status indicators glow a steady, reassuring green. A few polite claps echo in the room, followed by quiet sighs of relief. Bryce nods approvingly, stepping back from the console. Below them, in the subterranean levels of the building, the massive crack-cooling units of the physical server room continue their deep, vibrating hum, blind and indifferent to the transition above. 2 hours later. The initial adrenaline of the deployment has settled into the quiet routine of a Monday morning shift. The command center is still, save for the rapid clicking of mice and the low hum of the ventilation system. High up on the center display, in the bottom left corner of a monitoring dashboard, a single widget flickers. The latency graph, previously a smooth valley of green, suddenly spikes into a sharp peak of yellow. A monitoring alert chimes, a singular electronic ping that cuts through the quiet room. A junior reliability engineer, staring at a side monitor, leans in and squints at the readout. He highlights a string of text, his brow furrowing. "David? Bryce?" the engineer calls out. "We have a latency spike on the eastern seaboard routing nodes." Bryce walks over to the engineer's desk, analyzing the screen. "Let the auto-scaling handle it. It's likely just the load balancers adjusting to the morning traffic spike." "Right," the engineer says, though he doesn't take his hand off the mouse. "It's just. The packets aren't routing, they're dropping. About 2% of our freight manifests just timed out. Keep an eye on it," Bryce instructs, his tone remaining even. "If the drop rate hits 5%, we'll manually spin up more instances to handle the queue." A minute passes. The polite electronic ping sounds again, then 3 more times in rapid succession. On the massive wall, the yellow peak doesn't go down. It climbs higher, turning a stark orange. Faintly, through the thick glass floor that separates the command center from the customer service department below, a new sound emerges. It starts as a low murmur. The scattered ringing of desk phones. Within 60 seconds, the scattered rings overlap, compounding into a relentless, chaotic drone. The lead engineer's hands fly across his keyboard. "Bryce, the API gateway is returning 503 errors. It's not connecting to the backend databases. The cloud architecture is trying to handshake with the mainframe to retrieve the shipping logs, but it's sending an unexpected data type. The legacy system is rejecting it." Bryce's expression tightens. He leans over the console. "Can we bypass the validation temporarily? Force the handshake?" "I can't override COBOL security protocols with a REST API command," David says, his voice strained. "The mainframe requires a specific batch processing sequence. It's locking us out. Dropped packets are at 12%. Ping, ping. The dashboard turns red. A flashing crimson warning bathes the sterile room in the color of an emergency. 35%. The junior engineer breathes out, staring at the screen. We've lost tracking on the entire Midwest fleet. Restart the container pods. Bryce orders, his voice urgent but controlled. Let's try to reset the connection pool and clear the backlog. It's not a compute issue, David says, over the rising volume of the room. The logic is caught in an infinite loop. CloudSync is requesting data. The mainframe denies it because of a formatting error. CloudSync retries automatically, and the mainframe is treating the rapid requests like a DDoS attack. The legacy firewall is shutting down external ports. The command center descends into a state of severe crisis. The blue glow is entirely gone, replaced by the panicked red of a cascading system failure. The monitors display endless streams of error logs. The noise from the customer service floor below is no longer a murmur. It's a deafening roar vibrating through the floorboards. Global freight halts. On the map, the thousands of moving green lines suddenly freeze, turning gray. We just lost the West Coast, a developer reports from across the room. Seattle Port Authority is locked out of the loading manifests. Trucks are idling at the gates. Miami distribution is blind. They don't know what's in the incoming containers. Bryce grips the edge of the console, his jaw clenched, as he evaluates the rapidly deteriorating metrics. We need to initiate a rollback. Cut the traffic back to the legacy environment. We can't do it from the cloud interface, David replies, wiping sweat from his forehead. The rollback requires manual intervention on the mainframe side to reset the routing tables and clear the firewall block. We're locked out of the administration panel. The double doors of the command center open. The VP of Operations walks in. He wears a dark suit, his expression grim and rigidly composed. The room quiets slightly as engineers notice his arrival, though the automated alarms continue to sound. He walks directly to the center console, stopping beside Bryce. Bryce, operations just called, the VP says, his voice tight. What's our status? We have thousands of freight trucks idling at distribution centers from Seattle to Miami. Bryce turns to him, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the crisis. We're experiencing a critical failure in the handshake between the cloud gateway and the legacy database. The mainframe is treating our retry logic as a hostile attack and has locked down all external ports. How long until we're back online? The VP asks, looking at the red wall of monitors. We have perishable goods sitting on docks. We're bleeding money by the minute. Bryce looks at the dashboard, then back to the VP. We don't have the access or the expertise to reset the mainframe routing manually. Our team only knows the cloud architecture. We need someone who understands the legacy system's security protocols. Then get the legacy administrator on the line immediately, the VP says. Bryce hesitates, the weight of the situation fully settling over him. He's not with the company anymore, Bryce says quietly. His position was eliminated during the restructuring last week. On the third floor, in a dark, quiet row of cubicles, an empty desk sits gathering dust. In the center of the desk, Arthur's heavy black emergency pager begins to vibrate. It buzzes against the desk, inching slowly toward the edge, sounding out into the empty room. The air in the command center is thick, heavy, with the frantic heat of 40 panicked bodies and the exhaust of overworked server racks. The massive Grafana monitoring screens covering the front wall are a blinding, unbroken wall of crimson red. Cascading error logs scroll past, too fast for the human eye to track. The harsh High-pitched mechanical whine of the crack cooling units fights a losing battle against the rising temperature on the floor. CEO Marcus pushes through the glass doors, his heavy footsteps cutting through the chaos. He doesn't look at the junior engineers scrambling over their keyboards. His eyes are locked on the front row of terminals, where Bryce is standing, his hands gripping the back of a mesh chair, his knuckles entirely white. "Explain it," Marcus says. His voice doesn't rise, but it carries a terrifying low-frequency weight that silences the immediate area. Bryce spins around, a thin layer of sweat shining on his forehead. The immaculate tailoring of his suit suddenly looks like a costume he's too small for. "Marcus, sir, we're experiencing a minor synergistic misalignment between the new cloud gateway and the on-premise iron. It's a handshake timeout. My team is currently implementing an agile optimization to force the rollback." "A mice misalignment," Marcus repeats flatly. "Every shipping container from Rotterdam to Los Angeles is frozen. Our freight manifests are locked. We're bleeding $80 million an hour, Bryce." "Don't give me buzzwords. Why is the system down?" Bryce swallows hard. He points a trembling finger at the main screen. "The legacy architecture. It rejected our API payloads. It's an antiquated bottleneck. We're sunsetting the legacy overhead, just like I proposed, but the old code is throwing a hard lock." Next to Bryce, a young systems engineer wearing a faded hoodie finally stops typing. He stares at his monitor, his face pale in the glow of the screen. "It's not a timeout," the kid says, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a data type mismatch." Marcus steps around Bryce, towering over the young engineer. "Speak English, son." The kid swallows, pointing at a terminal window filled with dense, blocky EBCDIC characters and ancient COBOL syntax. The new Cloud API sent a floating point decimal for a freight weight. The mainframe database was built to only accept fixed-length integers. When the decimal hit the legacy routing algorithm, it didn't just reject it. It treated it as a core memory corruption. The mainframe threw a fail-safe vault lock over the entire global database to protect itself from us. "Then unlock it," Marcus snaps. "Revert the data type." "I can't," the kid says, panic finally cracking his voice. "Nobody here can. It's a black box. The routing algorithms aren't documented on the wiki. It's all raw COBOL, written 30 years ago. It's the ultimate bus factor, sir." Marcus frowns. "Bus factor." "If the one guy who built it gets hit by a bus," the kid explains, wiping sweat from his eyes, "the company dies. Only one person has the root credentials and the actual architectural knowledge to bypass the vault lock from the command line." Marcus slowly turns his head toward Bryce. "Who?" Bryce avoids eye contact, staring intensely at the floor tiles. Arthur Pendleton." "Call him," Marcus demands. "We did," the kid says. "His emergency pager was left on his desk. It's been buzzing for an hour." Marcus freezes. A cold, heavy realization drops in his stomach. He looks toward the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the room. He remembers yesterday afternoon, the quiet, gray-haired man in the faded trench coat, the cardboard box filled with desk trinkets, the humiliating walk out of the lobby doors and into the freezing downpour. Marcus looks back at Bryce, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "The man I saw carrying a box to his car yesterday. You fired him." "We were sunsetting legacy overhead." Bryce blurts out, his voice cracking, desperate to maintain his authority. "He was a bottleneck. He refused to embrace the cloud migration." Marcus doesn't scream. He simply turns his back on Bryce, pulling his phone from his coat pocket as he marches toward the exit. "Don't touch another keyboard," Marcus throws over his shoulder. "If you break anything else before I get back, I'll personally see you ruined." The ticking of a brass grandfather clock is the loudest sound in Arthur's living room. It's a small, meticulously organized space. A worn leather armchair sits by the window. The smell of Earl Grey tea and old paper hangs in the air. Outside, the rain comes down in heavy, relentless sheets, blurring the streetlights into streaks of amber. Arthur stands in his small kitchenette, wearing a thick wool cardigan. He holds a porcelain teapot, pouring a thin, steady stream of steaming water into his cup. He doesn't look at the clock. He's entirely, profoundly unbothered. A heavy, frantic pounding echoes from the front door. It's erratic, desperate, completely out of rhythm with the quiet cadence of the house. Arthur sets the teapot down. He takes a slow breath, adjusts his glasses, and walks to the door. He opens it. Marcus stands on the porch. The billionaire CEO is soaked to the bone, his expensive cashmere overcoat ruined, water dripping from his jawline and pooling on the wooden floorboards. He's breathing hard, as if he sprinted from his car. "Arthur," Marcus says, his voice ragged. Arthur looks at him. He doesn't step aside. He doesn't offer a towel. "Marcus, it's late." "The network is dead," Marcus says, the words spilling out in a panicked rush. "The cloud migration failed. The mainframe threw a vault lock. Global freight is completely halted. We're losing over $1 million every 60 seconds." Arthur simply stares at him, his face an unreadable mask. "I left my pager on my desk, Marcus. You should have called it." "I know," Marcus breathes, stepping just inside the doorway, bringing the frantic, desperate energy of the corporate collapse into Arthur's quiet sanctuary. "I know what Bryce did. It was a mistake. A massive, catastrophic mistake. I need you in the server room. Right now." Arthur turns his back on the CEO and walks slowly to his armchair. He picks up his teacup. He takes a long, slow sip. "Name your price," Marcus begs, following him into the living room, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood. "Double your old salary, a massive signing bonus, stock options, whatever it takes. I'll write the check right now. Just come back." Arthur lowers the teacup. He looks out the window at the rain. "I'm no longer an employee, Marcus," Arthur says quietly. "I have no interest in returning to the payroll." Marcus nods rapidly, swiping wet hair out of his eyes. "A contractor, then. An independent consultant. Anything you want." Arthur slowly turns his head. His eyes meet Marcus's. The quiet systems administrator is gone. In his place is the architect of the machine, laying down the absolute law of his domain. "My terms are non-negotiable," Arthur says, his voice smooth and cold as steel. "First, I require a consulting fee of $3 million, payable immediately into an escrow account before I step foot in the building." Marcus doesn't even blink. Done. "Second, absolute, uncontested root access across all environments. Legacy and cloud. No oversight committees. No agile scrums. No change approval boards. When I'm on the terminal, I'm the only authority." "Agreed," Marcus says, practically shaking with relief. "Whatever you need." Arthur sets the teacup down on the saucer with a soft final clink, and third. Marcus goes completely still, waiting. Bryce. The name hangs in the air, heavy and sharp. "Before I touch a single keyboard," Arthur says, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "he's terminated. He doesn't get a severance package. He doesn't get a graceful exit or a press release about pursuing other opportunities. He cleans out his desk, and he's escorted off the property by security. Tonight." Marcus stares at Arthur. The sheer, ruthless finality of the demand hangs between them. Marcus swallows hard, reaching into his soaked coat for his phone. "I'll make the call," Marcus says. The command center is a war zone of flashing red strobes and the deafening, frantic hum of the raised floor servers. Engineers are shouting over the noise, pointing at decaying network graphs. The panic has reached a fever pitch. Then, the heavy glass doors of the elevator bank slide open. Arthur steps onto the floor. His coat is perfectly dry. He carries his battered, decades-old leather briefcase in his right hand. He walks with a slow, measured cadence, the heavy rubber soles of his shoes thudding against the hollow metal floor tiles. The shouting dies. It happens in a ripple. One by one, the junior engineers notice him. They stop typing. They lower their voices. They step back from the aisles. Within 10 seconds, the frantic clicking of keyboards vanishes completely. The only sound left in the massive room is the mechanical roar of the crack cooling units and the distant screech of a server alarm. The crowd parts for him like the Red Sea. Bryce stands in the center of the main console. He looks like a man facing a firing squad. His perfectly styled hair is plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. His tie is loosened. His eyes dart frantically around the room, realizing that his entire team has stopped working to watch the old man walk toward him. Bryce tries to salvage a single scrap of his dignity. He forces a stiff, terrified smile and steps forward, holding his hands out in a placating gesture. "Arthur," Bryce says, his voice thin and cracking over the hum of the servers. "Look, I know we've had our differences regarding the legacy overhead, but I'm glad we could bring you in for this synergistic integration fix. If you just follow my cloud-first runbook, we can get this." Arthur stops. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't raise his hand. He simply turns his head, very slowly, and looks directly into Bryce's eyes. The glare is absolute. It's the cold, dead-eyed look of a man staring at an insect on a windshield. There is no anger in his expression, no gloating, no triumph. Just utter, freezing, elemental dismissal. It's a look that instantly strips away Bryce's MBA degrees, his tailored suit, and his arrogant bluster, reducing him to a child who broke something he couldn't possibly comprehend. Bryce's mouth hangs open. The buzzwords die in his throat. The sheer weight of Arthur's silence crushes the breath out of him. Trembling, his face flushed dark red with public humiliation, Bryce takes a slow, stumbling step backward. Then another. He shrinks away from the console, retreating into the shadows of the server racks, completely emasculated under the collective, judging gaze of his entire department. Arthur breaks the eye contact, dismissing Bryce entirely. He walks to the primary terminal. He sets his worn leather briefcase on the desk, pops the brass latches, and pulls out his reading glasses. He slides them onto his face, pulls out the mesh chair, and sits down at the keyboard. The screen glows green with the raw command line prompt, waiting for the architect. The air in the subterranean server center was a sterile, unforgiving 58 degrees. The massive crack units roared along the walls, a ceaseless mechanical gale pushing freezing air up through the perforated floor tiles. It was a noise that usually meant safety. Today, it sounded like a countdown. The walls were bathed in the sickly crimson glow of 50 wall-mounted monitors. The global Datadog dashboards bled red across every time zone. Grafana charts that tracked logistics flow and freight routing had flatlined into jagged, dying pulses. On the central console, a plastic physical pager, the ultimate, final escalation alarm, flashed a frantic, useless strobe. Arthur pulled out the heavy, metal-framed chair at the primary terminal. He sat down slowly. He didn't look at Marcus, who stood frozen near the reinforced glass door, knuckles white. He didn't look at Bryce, who was pressed against a server rack in the corner, clutching a dead tablet, his face the color of spoiled milk. Arthur's eyes were locked on the monitor. Resting on the desk was a mechanical keyboard, a massive, scarred Model M yellowed with decades of use. Arthur rested his fingertips on the heavy, spring-loaded keys. He took a single, slow breath of the frigid air. His hands became a blur. Clack, 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 clack. The sound of the heavy mechanical switches cracked like pistol shots over the hum of the cooling units. Arthur bypassed the failing graphical user interfaces entirely, dropping straight into the root command line. The monitor reflected in his wire-rimmed glasses, pure, absolute black, cut by the harsh, jagged green of monospace text. He didn't pause to read the cascading error logs. He already knew what they said. The Cloud API was trying to handshake with the mainframe, using a translated protocol that didn't exist, creating an infinite loop that was choking the processor's memory. Arthur stopped typing. He pushed his chair back and stood up. Moving with a fluid, practiced certainty, he walked away from the console and approached the massive tape silo at the back of the room. The young, panicked system engineers parted for him like water. He bypassed the biometric scanners with a master physical key he pulled from his pocket. He yanked open the heavy metal door of the archive array. From his worn leather satchel, Arthur pulled a thick, rectangular LTO backup tape. It was the exact cartridge he had quietly slipped into his bag on the afternoon Bryce had fired him. He slammed the cartridge into the master drive bay. The heavy mechanical shriek of magnetic tape, spooling up at maximum velocity, joined the roar of the room. Arthur walked back to the chair. He sat. His fingers hovered over the keys for a fraction of a second. Clack, clack, clack! He typed the override commands in pure, archaic COBOL. 666! Disconnect nowed. He was severing Bryce's entire cloud migration layer, amputating the infected limb with a dull hatchet. The terminal paused. A flashing prompt appeared, demanding the highest level of administrative authorization. Arthur typed a string of 72 characters from memory. He didn't blink. He hit enter. For 5 agonizing seconds, the room held its breath. The tape drive screamed as it dumped terabytes of foundational routing data directly into the mainframe's memory, bypassing the shattered cloud infrastructure entirely and forcing the system to remember how it used to work. On the far wall, a single red bar flickered. It turned amber. Then a wave of emerald green washed across the primary European Datadog cluster. The secondary routing nodes in Asia-Pacific lit up, green. The North American freight manifest queue, stuck at absolute zero for 9 agonizing hours, began to spin. 5,000 transactions per second, 10,000, 50,000. The collective exhale of 20 engineers sounded like a sudden depressurization of the room. Someone in the back row let out a choked, wet sob. Then the cheering started. It erupted, bouncing off the metal racks, raw and deafening. Marcus leaned against the glass door, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with relief. Arthur didn't cheer. He didn't look at Marcus, and he didn't even glance in Bryce's direction. He leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and calmly hit the key combination to lock his terminal. 6 months later, sunlight streamed into the glass-walled atrium of the corporate headquarters, catching the dust motes, dancing in the warm air. Bryce walked slowly toward the revolving doors. His designer suit hung a little loose on his frame. His shoulders were slumped. In his arms, he carried a standard-issue brown cardboard box. Inside was a personalized coffee mug, a handful of expensive gel pens, and a framed plaque detailing his Agile Optimization certification. 2 heavy-set security guards flanked him, their expressions completely neutral. They didn't push him, but their presence was an absolute, suffocating weight. Bryce stopped just short of the glass doors and looked back over his shoulder. The lobby was bustling with mid-morning traffic, but nobody looked at him. They actively shifted their gaze, staring at their phones, the floor, the ceiling. He was a ghost. Bryce swallowed hard, pushed through the heavy revolving door, and stepped out into the unforgiving heat of the pavement. Deep below, in the subterranean chill of the mainframe vault, the atmosphere was entirely different. The deafening roar of the crack units had been professionally baffled, reduced to a steady, comforting hum in the background. Arthur stood before a massive white dry erase board, a black marker in his hand. He wasn't wearing his faded windbreaker today. He wore a crisp, dark button-down shirt. Sitting in a semicircle of folding chairs were 12 fresh-faced engineers. They held notebooks, some held tablets, but their eyes were locked entirely on the old man at the front of the room. Arthur drew a massive, solid square on the whiteboard. This, Arthur's voice was a low, steady gravel, is the iron. It doesn't care about your sprint velocity. It doesn't care about your synergistic bandwidth. He tapped the board with the marker, a sharp, echoing thwack. It cares about memory allocation. It cares about precise, unyielding logic. You don't build a skyscraper on a swamp, and you don't route $5 billion of global freight through an API you barely understand just because the user interface looks pretty. One of the young engineers, a girl with bright blue hair and a nervous posture, raised her hand tentatively. "But what about the bus factor?" she asked. "If you're the only one who knows how to maintain the legacy COBOL structures, what happens if you aren't here?" Arthur stopped. He looked at the girl, then let his gaze drift across the rest of the faces staring back at him. There was no arrogance in their eyes, only an intense, unironic hunger to learn how the machine actually worked. He set the marker down on the aluminum tray. "That," Arthur said, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners, "is exactly why you're all here. The bus factor is no longer one." He turned back toward the primary terminal. The massive screen cast a warm, steady green glow across the room, reflecting in the lenses of his glasses. Arthur smiled.